By the end of this video, I'll expect you to be familiar with the portion of the flow where we check a to-be relationship in a conversation with users and 3 possible outcomes. In the last video, we introduced the subordinate to-be relationship and distinguished it from a plain to-be relationship. How does this fit into the flow? Returning to this diagram for the flow, there are some steps we haven't covered in the upper right. These are for to-be relationships. I'll zoom in. Here are the steps. Having a newly discovered relationship, suppose that we determine that it is to be. First, we will consider synonymy, which means checking if the two entities mean the same thing. If they are the same, we merge them into one entity. If they're not synonyms, next we'll consider subordination, which means we see if the shape like job and part-time job from the last video applies. If so, we can add a bar and convert to a subordinate entity. If there is no subordination, finally we end with a plain to-be relationship. By the end, if we still have either kind of to-be relationship, the next step is to seek other relationships between those same two entities, and this starts the flow over again. We will cover this step more in future videos. For now, understand that the flow is actually a cycle of continuous delivery that only ends when the modeler and users agree that the overall data model is satisfactory and meets the needs at hand. Let's suppose we just ask the users if there's some association between a file and a resource. And their answer is, a file is a resource. We've just discovered a to-be relationship between file and resource. What do we do next? The first step is to consider synonymy. When we discover to-be relationships, there's a fairly strong possibility of synonymy, where two entity names mean exactly the same thing. Recall that when we check for chicken feet, we always ask 2 questions, one for each side of the relationship. We will do the same sort of thing here. To make sure these things are not really synonyms, we should ask 2 separate questions. We ask, is there such a thing as a file that is not a resource? And is there such a thing as a resource that is not a file? If these 2 are synonyms, the users will say no to both questions. When we discover a synonym, we will not maintain both terms as separate entities on the diagram. This just confuses things. Instead, we will combine all the descriptors for these entities into one entity and ask the users to choose a name. This will typically be one of the 2 names we started with. We will also probably want to choose one identifier, but we could keep both identifiers if the users consider this appropriate. If we did not discover synonyms, then the next step is to consider subordination. This means we're going to consider whether these 2 should share the same identifier and thereby allow one entity to be subordinate to the other. But we're following the process correctly, and these of course already have identifiers. So how could one become subordinate? Effectively, what we're doing here is revisiting the identifiers to see if we got one wrong. This is called misidentification. First, we can revisit each of our existing identifiers for a mistake by checking the identifiers carefully, asking the users to verify them. That might be all we need to do. If the identifiers persist as is, we can check each entity to see if the other entity's identifier fully covers it. Let's hypothesize that file is a subordinate of resource, and therefore the file name is not the best identifier. We can test this by asking, is a resource ID required for each file? And can 2 files have the same resource ID? If they answered yes and no, then we can see that resource ID can act as an identifier for file. So we will want the users to choose which identifier is best for file. We can ask, both file name and resource ID are able to serve as identifiers for file. What is the best way to distinguish one file from another? The users might insist that both should be usable for identification, but they will likely choose file name or resource ID. If they do choose resource ID, then we've just found a subordinate entity, and we can change the identifier by erasing the file name and adding bar to the resource link. If we did not discover a subordinate entity, then we've confirmed that we have a plain to-be relationship, and this is the end of the flow. This means that each kind of thing on the left can have an interpretation of the other kind of thing on the right, but not necessarily. We might have files that are resources. We also might have files that are not resources, and resources that are not files. And we want the system to remember both. And in this example, apparently handle locking on those resources. Now check your understanding.